Hello everybody, welcome to the county seat. I'm Chad Booth. It is our privilege today to have a conversation for the next half hour with Senator Mike Lee, the senior senator from the state of Utah, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I know there are people all over the state who are anxious to hear what the conversation is going to be today.
No, pleasure's mine. Thank you.
I would like to start with your work on PILT and what's happening right now. This is an ongoing problem that rural counties have just beat their heads against the wall for the longest time. So, you know, what steps are coming out of Washington on that right now?
I introduced legislation just a few days ago, the PILT Act, that's designed to get the government to start performing a valuation of each parcel of land it owns. We need to know what the land is worth in order for us to know whether counties are being compensated for it fairly through the payment in lieu of taxes program. As you know, in many of our counties, many of our most rural counties, where a lot of the counties where they have 95% plus federal land are getting the most raw deal, especially if they've got smaller populations. So we think that we ought to be trying to bring about a rough approximation of the tax revenue that would otherwise be generated if it were not owned by the federal government and if the federal government hadn't declared itself exempt from all taxation. And after all, the term payment in lieu of taxes, as the program is described, is supposed to describe something that provides a rough approximation. So this calls for evaluation to be done, and what I want is for us to move in a direction where counties will have the option, if they want to stick with the current formula that is based on a combination of factors, including population, how much they've gotten in previous years, and so forth, they should be able to stick with that. But if they want to go with a rough approximation based on the current assessed value, they should have that option too.
In the current formula right now, counties, because of the population and land, counties that really don't need the help quite as much, and I don't want to pick on any of Utah's more populated, quote, rural counties with federal lands, but they end up getting quite a bit of money, and places like PILT County, where they desperately need every penny that they can get off of the federal lands, or Garfield, don't get really anything.
Washington County does relatively well, not as well as I think it could if the federal government didn't own quite so much of their land. But compared to other counties, they do fairly well, in part because they've got a bigger population, but they've also got a lot of acres of federal land. But as you point out, there are other counties, including PILT, Kane, Garfield, San Juan, Wayne County, where the federal government owns a lot of land. They've got much smaller populations. They don't fare as well. They ought to have a fair shot at all of this. And you know, as governments struggle to fund their school systems, their police departments, search and rescue, all of these things are strained by excessive federal land ownership, and that strain is made even more acute by virtue of the fact that the government's not really even attempting, under current law, to try to value the land or to provide that rough approximation. That's what we want.
So is part of this a funding problem that comes up as far as the Senate and the legislature funding properly for it?
Yeah, that's part of it, but it's only part of it. Because, you know, really it ought to be something that we do automatically. Congress typically comes through for what it's decided it's going to fund. But it does so in a way that's not really designed to offset the real burden for the county at issue. The real burden consists of what it's not receiving. This is before we even get to how restrictive federal land management policy is, and that it may be more aggressive in some areas than others. Even before you get to the lost economic activity resulting from that, you have the earlier issue, the upstream issue of PILT, of the fact that they're not getting anywhere near the same amount of tax revenue that they would get if this were in private hands. In most counties, we're looking at pennies on the dollar is what they're receiving compared to what they would get if they were taxing it even at their lowest rate.
In looking at this, is this going to be harder to do with, I mean, getting it into the legislature? You've got a little bit better shot because the gap is narrowed, but I mean, you guys are in a dead heat in the Senate, so.
Yeah, we are. We are. One of the things that I hope to continue to utilize is the fact that this does affect red and blue states. Sure, a lot of them are red, but some of them are blue. States like Washington and Oregon, New Mexico, and California, certainly, they all have a lot of federal land, and they too are impacted by this. I have conversations with Democratic colleagues from some of those states all the time about PILT. So this need not be a Republican versus Democratic issue. It's not an easy issue to aggress on for the simple reason that most senators are not from public land states within either party. I've spent the last 10 years doing everything I can to educate my colleagues about it, but still, for those who aren't from a state where this is an issue, it takes a lot of reminding to get them to focus on this.
Have you, through your efforts, and I know Rob Bishop, when he was in the House, spent a lot of time trying to overcome this stigma of cowboy welfare, as some people refer to it. Have you made headway on that?
Sure, especially when I'm able to point out stories, when I'm able to explain the real-world impacts of large-scale federal land ownership coupled with land management policies made by people 2,000 miles away who neither live near nor have any day-to-day involvement with the land in question. Little by little, people start to get that.
While we're on the subject, I would like to flip and redirect on the fact that in the last administration they went to great lengths to try and decentralize. Do you see that is maybe going to go the other way? Because talk about monuments being revisited and different plans may have an impact on this.
Yeah. Anytime you move toward more federal control over almost anything, certainly this is true with federal land management policy, you're going to be dealing with centralization rather than decentralization of power. It's the natural nature of the beast. I had great respect for those in the previous administration who were working to try to reverse that. But as you note, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of appetite to continue in that direction under the current administration.
So let's talk for a minute about 30 and 30, because this is a new slogan, 30 and 30, 50 by 50, which is a percentage based on the calendar year. What do you see if the administration is successful in doing that? What's going to be the impact on the West?
Chad, here's the curious thing about 30 by 30. We don't know exactly what it even means. One way of reading it is that they want to make sure that 30% of the land in the United States is in some type of protected status by 2030, by the end of this decade. Depending on what the numerator is and what the denominator consists of, we may be there already, or at least really, really close to it. Perhaps we've even exceeded it, depending on what you count in the numerator and what you count in the denominator. We actually have no idea. I searched in vain for some time trying to find a definitive answer on this, and I haven't been able to find it so far. Now, there are a lot of environmental groups who are advocating it, who seem to presuppose that we're at 12% now. That 12% of the land in the United States is currently protected to their liking. I have yet to see anyone explain exactly what that consists of or what parameters they're using to define that numerator. But it's difficult for me to know what they've got in mind when they don't even tell us what their criteria are. What I mean by the fact that we might be there already, by some definitions, is that, something close to 30% of the landmass in the United States is already owned by the federal government. All federal land is, by virtue of it being federal, already in some type of protected status. And so it's entirely possible that we've come close to that by some definitions, probably not theirs, but they won't tell us what those criteria are. If, in fact, we accept the premise that some of the environmental groups have, that it's only 12% of the land that they consider currently protected, where's the rest of that going to come from? So that means there's an additional 18% of all land in the United States that they want to add to that. Where is that going to come from? Given the fact that the federal government doesn't have sort of management authority over non-federal land, one has to assume that they're going to look almost exclusively to federal land to do this. And what that means is that for states like ours that already have a lot of federal land, the burden is going to be placed disproportionately on us, and that concerns me.
And that should be a concern. Do you think this is a serious push, or do you think it's sloganeering?
Well, it certainly is very effective sloganeering in the sense that they're effectively marshaling a slogan in a way that's gotten a lot of support, and that's even got the current President of the United States and his new Interior Secretary embracing it publicly. So it is an effective use of a slogan, and so far it appears to be making some progress in convincing a lot of policymakers to jump on board. The problem I have with it is I still have no idea what it means. In other words, it sounds like a neat slogan for a lot of people, but until they tell me what it means, it's impossible for me to understand how someone could jump on board with it and wholeheartedly embrace it and say, we're going to legislate until this is done. I don't know how anyone can agree with that without first knowing what they're agreeing to.
Well, I suppose that's true. I mean, you've got wilderness study areas, you've got areas of environmental concern. I mean, with even not thinking about it, I can tick off 6 or 7 categories of land.
Even after you go through those very protected classes of land, you've still got NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act is going to govern and serve effectively as a restriction on the use of most of that land. And you've got FLIPMA that will serve as a restriction for a whole lot of it. And you've got various grazing laws, various laws governing mineral extraction. All of those serve to offer up some type of protected status for the land in question. So it remains to be seen what they're counting and what they're not. But it makes me very nervous that they think we've got to add an additional 18% beyond the existing 12% that some other groups are saying, because that's going to come disproportionately from states like ours. It's going to be very tempting, in fact, for a Democratic administration to look to a state like Utah, where we've got an enormous amount of federal land. 2/3 of the land is already owned by the federal government, that already votes overwhelmingly for Republicans. And so they've sort of written us off as a loss politically anyway. That would be an overwhelming temptation for them to just declare a few more million acres of national monument in our state, or do other things like that exclusively through executive authority channels. That's not good for Utahns, and I don't think it's good for the country.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about something that's more direct and more immediate and having more of an impact here in the state of Utah. We'll be right back with the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. Our privilege and honor to talk to Senator Lee. And we've been talking about public land, which seems to always be what you and I talk about. What about
the most important thing we could talk about in some ways?
Yeah, right? That's true. Let's talk a little bit about the 60-day moratorium and the impact that's had on energy production and parts of the state of Utah.
Yeah. Whenever an administration decides to push pause on energy leasing, it has an effect. It's an effect that isn't usually felt immediately because it takes a while from the moment you issue a moratorium on the issuance of new leases. It takes a while for that to be felt in the pipeline, no pun intended there. But it does have an effect. And if this moratorium stays in place very long, it should be of concern not only to all Utahns, but to all Americans, regardless of how closely connected their job might be to the energy extraction and production industry. And the reason is American energy independence is important. It's important for us to be able to get most or all, or at least have the potential of producing most or all of our liquid fuels from sources within North America. Now, look, there's a global commoditization that's occurred for oil and to a lesser extent natural gas, although natural gas is becoming a little bit more of a global commodity and something that we have in great abundance here. But the fact that it's become a global commodity doesn't mean that we ought not have as an aim an ability to produce as much as or more than what we consume. It's good for our economy. It's good for the environment, given that we can produce it better, more effectively, more efficiently, and in a more environmentally sound manner here in the United States than they can anywhere else. So the moratorium scares me. It's not that it scares me for the immediate purposes. It's what happens just, a few months or a few years down the road, when the longer that moratorium continues, the fewer future development projects are being undertaken.
Is the impact kind of a Doppler-like effect where you drop a pebble in a pond?
I think that is a good comparison. The ripples will grow more regular, and over time, as the effect is carried out, they'll get bigger, especially if you keep dropping them. And you keep dropping bigger and bigger pebbles. That's what's going to happen if we stay stuck in this rut.
Well, already, we've seen a huge increase in gas prices just in a short period of time, which should be affecting people all over the country and economies in every state.
Yeah, that's right. Now, there are those who will point out, with some good reason, that there are other factors at play in the increase in gasoline costs of late. You've had a lot of people who were traveling less at the height of the COVID lockdowns who are now starting to travel more. So demand is up. And so, yeah, there are some market forces that naturally were going to drive prices up a little from where they were. I suspect that they might have gone up more than they might have otherwise, or that they at least could in the very near-term future go up more than they otherwise would have, but for this moratorium. Because that sends a signal when the U.S. government, which controls a lot of the land where a lot of our oil and gas is produced, says we're going to push pause on all new leasing. It's going to have an effect. And some of that will be built in to the global commodities market, resulting in, among other things, higher prices.
Okay, great. We're going to take another break. We'll come right back here to the county seat, our conversation with Senator Mike Lee. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking with Senator Mike Lee. As we sit here and talk about all these impacts, we're taking something for granted in all this. Is how did we get here? How did the federal government in the West end up owning so much of the land and it never got turned back over? We've had this conversation before, but there are some larger, broader pictures that need to be explored in that area.
There are. A dear friend of mine and someone who I've learned a lot from in this area is Ken Ivory, former state representative, who is someone who's dedicated much of his professional career to researching the history of federal public lands and how they're allocated. And one of the things that he and I have talked a lot about is the fact that as westward expansion occurred, going all the way back really to the Louisiana Purchase, as states were being added, similar language was put in the enabling legislation of just about every new state, saying that unincorporated lands within the state's boundaries would be held for a time by the federal government, but with the understanding that they'd eventually be sold and that 5% of the proceeds for the sale of that land would be put into a trust fund for the state's public education system. That was honored for states throughout the Gulf Coast and in the Midwest, a lot of the Louisiana Purchase states, for example. Over time, it was honored. There was a Missouri senator in the 1800s named Thomas Hart Benton who fought aggressively for this because there was a time when a lot of these states still had a lot of public land. And he said, look, the point of it was not to have the federal government own this much land for this long of a period of time. It's supposed to dispose of it, except for what it decides that it needs. For example, for military installations or otherwise. Today we would add to that list national parks and national recreation areas and things like that. The question that I think we ought to be asking is, why haven't we followed that same pattern? Why is it okay for the federal government to own this much of the land in a small handful of states? And is this land really being managed better? Is it actually better for the environment? Is it actually better for the school children, not only of Utah, but of every other state where the federal government owns this much land? And is it fair to these states? There's language that was built into the so-called enclave clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. It refers to the fact that Congress will be the sole sovereign lawmaking body for what we now call the District of Columbia and for any other land purchased by the consent of the host state's legislature. That was added to the Constitutional Convention in response to a concern raised by Elbridge Gerry in early September of 1787, who looked at the power Congress might wield over public land and said, we've got to make sure that Congress doesn't compel states to an undue obedience to the general government. And to that end, they decided to add language saying that Congress would have that authority if and only if Congress had acquired that land, had purchased it by the consent of the host state's legislature. It's that sovereign bundle of rights that would have to be voluntarily relinquished by a state in order to give Congress the authority that includes things like the power to tax, which gets back to the PILT issue we were discussing earlier. Really, if the federal government wants to own land, in some ways it can, but for it to be able to declare itself the sole sovereign lawmaking authority over it, such that it can decide whether or not it's subject to a state's taxing power, that really should be contingent upon whether our legislature has voluntarily relinquished that right to Congress, which in most cases it has not.
Wow, that's a powerful thing to think about. It also brings us to the end of our half hour. Can you believe it's gone by that quick?
Too quickly, far too quickly.
I know. I would love to have you come back and carry on this conversation again. Thank you for joining us here, and thank you for participating in the county seat. Please share this conversation with your friends. There's far too much to cover, and we are going to have to ask you to come back sometime.
Will do.
Okay, very good. Remember, local government is where your life happens. Really be involved. Share this with your friends, and we would love to hear your feedback. I think even the senator would, through our social media channels. So get on there and tell us what you think. We'll see you next week on the county seat. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.